Rosario Vega had just pulled the last log from the woodpile when the storm swallowed the mountain. If you believe there are men who love their families from beyond the grave, subscribe to Cuentos del Viejo Campo and ring the bell. This is the story of a woman who almost froze, and of the map her husband drew before he died. The night Esteban died, the candle burned down to nothing, and the children were asleep, and the cold that came through the walls of the cabin was not the ordinary cold of the Sierra. It was the kind that settles into wood and plaster and does not leave until March. Rosario had sat beside him since the afternoon, holding his hand after the fever had taken his voice, listening to his breathing slow the way water slows in a stream before the first freeze. He was 41 years old. He had coughed all autumn. The doctor from the village had come twice, and the second time he had left without saying much. And that silence had told Rosario everything she had been hoping it would not tell her. What she had not expected was the map. Esteban had pressed it into her hand the morning before he died, when he still had words, but was spending them carefully, the way a man counts out the last of his money, knowing the amount, deliberate with each coin. He had pressed the folded cloth into her palm and closed her fingers over it and looked at her with those dark eyes that had looked at her across 30 years and 3 children and more difficult seasons than she had names for. "When the snow comes hard," he said, "not before. Only when it comes hard." He held her hand tighter. "You'll know where to go. I made it so you'd know." 3 days after they buried Esteban in the churchyard at Canellas, with the wind pulling at the priest's robe and the children standing close together without being told to, Sir Para had already come and gone. He arrived the afternoon of the burial itself, a stocky man with city shoes that were wrong for the mud, and a leather satchel that he held in front of him with both hands as though it were a gift. He said he was sorry for her loss. He said Esteban had been a man of his word, which made what he had to say next all the more unfortunate. He unfolded a document, something about land debt, something about 3 years of arrears, something about a cordial resolution. Rosario had stood at the door holding the frame with one hand because her legs were not entirely reliable that afternoon, and she had told him she needed time. He had said, Of course, take all the time you need," and left the document and the pen on her table with the practiced ease of a man who had done this before. She had not touched the pen. But she had not been able to stop looking at it either. And then the sky closed over the Sierra like a slow fist. It was not a gentle snowfall. It was the kind that comes low and fast and quiet and stacks against the door, so that by morning you cannot open it from the inside. It was the kind that silences the birds and the goats and even the creek, pressing everything under a white weight that does not ask permission. Their cabin sat at the high edge of the Sierra, where the pines grew so dense and tall that the wind spoke differently through them, lower and more serious than anywhere else in Durango. The nearest neighbor was 40 minutes on foot in good weather. In a storm like this, 40 minutes was another country. Rosario had 3 children. Consuelo was 14 and capable, the kind of girl who did not ask whether there was something to be done when it was clear that something needed doing. Beto was 9, healthy and afraid of the storm in the way boys that age are afraid of things, loudly at first, then quietly once he understood that his noise was making it harder for everyone else. And then there was little Clara, who was 6 years old and had been born with lungs the doctor called delicate. Lungs that did not do well in cold, lungs that had cost Rosario 2 winters of sleeping, sitting up beside her through the worst nights, one hand on the girl's back, monitoring the rise and fall, listening for the tightening that meant she needed to be moved closer to the fire, or the fire needed to be built higher, or both. The woodpile was almost gone. Rosario counted what remained on the second morning of the storm. 7 logs. She held that number in her mind and turned it over and counted it again, as if the second count might change it. It did not. 7 logs was not enough to last another night at the temperature Clara needed. The fire had to hold above a certain warmth, or the girl's chest would begin to close. And once it began to close, they were hours from help in conditions that did not welcome the journey. She stood at the window and looked at the white wall the storm had made of the world. She looked at Clara sleeping near the stove. She looked at the 7 logs. Then she went and got the map. She unfolded the cloth on the kitchen table and smoothed it flat with both hands. Esteban had drawn it with care and patience on a piece of coarse maguey cloth, the kind that does not tear easily, the kind a man chooses when he means for something to last. He had drawn the cabin at the center, the trail north, marked with 3 pine shapes, a ridge line drawn with a steady hand, and then, at the far right edge of the cloth, marked with a small X inside a circle, a shape that could only be the crescent of the hollow she knew from passing below it a dozen times on the North Trail without ever thinking to look up. Under the X, in Esteban's small, careful handwriting, were 4 words, "Lo que necesitan está." What you need is there. Rosario looked at the window. The snow was still falling. She looked at Clara. She looked at Consuelo. "How long to that cliff on the North Trail?" she asked. Consuelo calculated without pausing, 40 minutes in summer. Today maybe an hour and a half. And back? Less. It's downhill coming home. Rosario folded the map carefully and placed it in her coat pocket alongside the battered pewter canteen that had been Esteban's, the one with the dented side from where he'd dropped it, climbing this same Sierra the year they were first married, young and sure of themselves, before they understood what a mountain was actually capable of. She had carried that canteen so long it had stopped feeling like an object. It felt more like a part of her hand. "Keep the fire going," she told Consuelo. "1 piece of wood every 30 minutes. Not 2. 1. Make it stretch." She looked at Beto. "You stay beside your sister. You don't take the blanket off her. You don't open that door for any reason. Not for any reason. Until I come back." "What if you don't come back before dark?" asked Beto. "Then you keep the blanket on her and you wait until morning," she said. "And I will be back before dark." She said it as a fact, the way Esteban used to say things, not as a reassurance, but as a statement of what was going to happen, because there was no acceptable alternative. Beto looked at her for a moment, and something in the steadiness of her voice settled him. He nodded. She wrapped herself in the thick wool blanket that Esteban's mother had woven when they first built the cabin. Dark brown, red thread, worked through the edges, dense enough to stop the wind, and tied it at the shoulders with the herb drying cord. 2 pairs of wool stockings, the axe from the hook by the door. Because in the Sierra in winter, you do not go anywhere without something in your hand that can be more than one thing. She pushed the door open against the snow and stepped out. The cold met her face the way a stone wall meets a hand. She pulled the blanket tighter and did not let herself think about the warmth she was leaving behind. That kind of thinking was a debt you paid on the way back, not on the way out. The North Trail had disappeared under the snow. The storm had smoothed the ground to a single continuous white surface. No roots, no path markers, no color to follow. But Esteban had taught her something about this trail over many years of walking it, the way a patient man teaches without calling it a lesson, that the stones he had stacked at intervals along the path, 3 and 4 rocks balanced on each other, which she had always thought were simply something he did with his hands while he thought, were placed specifically so that their shapes would push up through light snow. She looked for them now, those small cairns, and found some of them, and used them to hold her line north, and when she could not find them she read the lean of the pines, which always tilted slightly east on the north slope from the prevailing winter wind, and she kept that lean on her left shoulder and pressed forward through the silence. The storm noise was remarkable. Not a silence exactly, but a muffling, the kind that takes the ordinary sounds of the world and folds them away somewhere unreachable. She could hear her own breathing. She could hear the creak of the wool blanket as she moved. She could hear nothing else. She walked for an hour, maybe more. Time did not behave normally in conditions like this. It stretched between one marker stone and the next until she stopped measuring it and simply moved, one step at a time, the way you get through things that cannot be gotten through any other way. Her boots were wet through before she reached the first ridge. Her face had passed the stage of stinging and arrived at the stage of not feeling much, which she understood as a signal worth heeding. She kept her arms moving. She talked to herself in the low voice she used when she was telling her children to calm down, quietly, practically, without drama. 1 foot. The next. The lean of the pines on your left. Keep the lean on your left. She thought about Clara's breathing. She thought about the 7 logs. She thought about Esteban standing at this table, drawing that map. How still his hands must have been. How deliberate. How he must have sat with it a long time, making sure it showed what it needed to show, and nothing more. She thought about the morning he pressed it into her hand, and how she had not asked him what it meant because some part of her had not wanted to know. She understood now that he had known she wouldn't ask. He had counted on her not asking. He had loved her well enough to spare her that particular wait until the wait was actually necessary. She reached the base of the cliff, but what Esteban had not told her, what the map could not have told her, because some things a man keeps to himself until the right moment, was that the hollow was not only showing her where to find firewood. The granite face rose pale and gray above the tree line, streaked dark where ice had crept into the cracks and set. She had always known it as simply a wall, the place where the walking country ended and the serious country began. She had never thought to look up from this angle. Esteban apparently had looked up many times. The hollow was exactly where the map said it would be. A wide, deep shelf cut into the rock face about 8 meters above the base, sheltered by a natural overhang so complete that no snow had touched the floor inside. From the trail below, you would never see it. You had to stand at the base and look straight up. That was what he had known. That was what he had drawn. The footholds were chipped into the granite, shallow, deliberate. 14 of them, climbing at an angle that favored a right-handed climber because Esteban was right-handed. She tested the first with the toe of her boot. The stone held. The ice had not reached inside the cuts. She tested the second. She put her weight on it. She climbed. The shelf was wide enough to stand in comfortably and deep enough that she stood completely out of the wind, and what she found inside stopped her still for a long moment. Not from the cold, but from what it told her about the man she had married. Esteban had come here many times. He had come here alone, without telling her, in the months before the worst of the illness settled in, and he had built a place. There were 7 bundles of dry pine wood, each one wrapped in oilskin, stacked against the back wall with the care of someone who had thought about the order in which they would be used. There were 2 sacks of dried corn, a woven bag with dried beans and chiles, and a solid block of piloncillo wrapped in cloth. 2 heavy wool serapes folded flat, a small tin of pine pitch for starting fires in wet conditions, and at the center of it all, wedged into a natural crack in the rock wall where it could not fall, was a sealed tin, the kind used for storing tobacco or lard, with a strip of cloth tied around it. On the cloth, in Esteban's handwriting, "Para cuando yo ya no est," for when I am no longer here. Rosario sat down on the stone floor of the shelf and held the tin in her hands. The wind moved far below her. The snow fell past the overhang in a gray curtain that did not touch her. She held the tin and did not open it immediately. She looked at the bundles of firewood stacked with such evenness against the back wall. She looked at the food sacks, tied neatly at the tops. She looked at the syrups folded into perfect squares. She thought about the months this had required. Not one trip but many. Each one made while he was weakening. Each one made without telling her, because telling her would have meant admitting what the trips were for. She thought about him climbing these 14 steps with an armload of oilskin-wrapped wood, his breath coming harder than it used to, pausing perhaps on the 7th step or the 9th to rest his lungs, and then continuing because the work was not done. She thought about him measuring, not guessing, but actually measuring and calculating what his family would need and for how long, and whether it would be enough. She thought about what it costs a person to love in that particular way. Forward-looking, practical, quiet, with nothing left over for his own comfort, because all of it had gone to theirs. To love people so completely that your dying time becomes preparation for their survival. Then she opened the tin. Inside, a letter folded 3 times. Beneath it, wrapped in a rag, 3 gold coins, heavy, old, the kind not seen in circulation for decades, but whose value no one would argue. And a second smaller cloth with a single line of writing, Los cobres son para el abogado. No le firmes nada al señor Parra sin que el padre Ignacio est presente. The coins are for the lawyer. Do not sign anything for Señor Parra without Father Ignacio present. Rosario's hands went still. Señor Parra had arrived 4 days after Esteban's burial, carrying a leather satchel and a document he called a consolidation of land debt. A debt, he said, that Esteban had owed him for 3 years. She had not known of the debt. She had not known of Señor Parra. He had been kind when he came, almost gentle, in the manner of men who have decided the person they are speaking to has no alternatives. He had given her until after the new year. He had left the document on the table with a pen beside it. The pen had sat there since, and Rosario had not touched it, but she had looked at it every morning. And 7 logs and a sick child and a blizzard have a way of making a person consider what she would not otherwise consider. But Esteban had known. He had been here ahead of her, thinking ahead of her, and he had left the answer before she knew the question existed. She read the letter. She read it twice, there on the cold stone shelf, with the snow falling in silence past the overhang. Then she folded it, closed it back in the tin, tucked the tin inside her coat next to the map in the canteen, loaded the first bundle of firewood across her shoulders with both serapes folded on top, and began to climb back down. She made 3 trips. On the last, she took the second bundle, the food bags, and the tin. The sky was graying at the edges of the storm when she pushed the cabin door open. She set everything down on the floor. Consuelo looked at the wood, really looked at it, counting the bundles, and said nothing. She simply picked up the first bundle and went to the stove and fed it without being told. Beto started to cry and pretended he wasn't. Clara slept on, her chest rising and falling with the steadiness that meant the fire had held. Rosario built the fire up properly for the first time in days. The cabin warmed from the floor upward. She sat in Esteban's chair and unfolded the map on her knee and looked at the X inside the circle and thought about 14 steps cut into granite by patient hands and 7 bundles of oilskin wrapped wood stacked against the back wall of a hollow cliff, and a man who had loved his family in the most practical and enduring way he knew how. The storm lasted 4 more days. They did not go cold again. When Ser Para returned in January with his satchel and his smooth voice and an air of inevitability, Father Ignacio was already seated at the table waiting for him, with the letter from the tin open before him and the 3 gold coins beside it. The notary from the village came the next morning. The district land registrar was consulted the following week. And the registrar, when asked the right questions by people who knew which questions to ask, confirmed that the document Ser Para had presented bore Esteban's signature, but had been notarized on a date when the notary named on the document had not yet received his license, a fact which made the contract, in the careful language of the registrar's written response, unenforceable in its current form. Ser Para stood in the cabin doorway with his satchel under his arm and looked at the coins on the table, and then at Father Ignacio, and then at Rosario. "I see your husband was a careful man," he said. "He was the most careful man I ever knew," said Rosario. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Ser Para folded his document without another word and put it away and left. 3 neighbors saw him ride out of the yard. By evening, everyone in Canelas who needed to know knew. The land was Rosario's. The debt was not. Father Ignacio waited until the sound of the horse had faded entirely. Then he looked at Rosario across the table. "He came to see me, you know. Esteban, months before the worst of it. He told me about Para. He told me about the coins. He asked me to be ready when the time came." Rosario was quiet for a moment. "He never said a word to me." "No," said Father Ignacio. "He said he didn't want you to carry it before you had to." The winter ran long that year, the way Durango winters do when they have decided to make a point. But it was not a cruel winter for the Vega family. The wood from the hollow cliff lasted through February. Clara's lungs held through the worst of the cold, and when April came, she ran in the yard as if she were trying to make up for all the months of stillness, laughing at the chickens, throwing her arms wide in the pale spring sun. Consuelo was already planning the garden. Beto had started stacking small stones along the path down to the road, 3 and 4 rocks balanced on each other, and when Rosario asked him why, he thought about it for a moment and said he didn't exactly know, that it just seemed like something useful to do. The map lived in the tin now, folded with the letter. The tin sitting on the shelf above the stove, where Esteban's pewter canteen hung beside it. Rosario had put them there together on purpose, the canteen and the tin, because some things belong side by side. Sometimes the most desperate moments are not the end. They are the place where someone who loved you well enough to think ahead reaches across the distance between the living and those who have gone, and leaves in your hands exactly what you need to survive. Do you believe that the hardest moments can be the beginning of something better? If this story moved you, leave your comment below and tell us where you are watching from. Subscribe to Cuentos del Viejo Campo and ring the bell so you never miss a story. And if you know someone who is carrying a long winter of their own right now, share this with them today. Until the next story. And they say in Canelas that on the coldest nights of every year since, when the snow stacks against the cabin doors and the Sierra wind speaks low through the pines, a steady light can be seen at the hollow cliff, warm and calm, the way a fire looks when someone left it burning on purpose, for whoever would need it next.